Some things in this world break your heart beyond repair, and watching children sold like cattle is one of them. In that cold northern market, two little boys held each other tight, knowing they might be torn apart forever. Their eyes held that look every parent fears most, the emptiness of children who have lost everything. Then a giant stepped forward. Erik Stormbringer was a mountain of a man. When he shouted, "Stop! I'll take those twins," everyone thought they knew what he wanted them for. They were wrong. What could possibly transform a legendary warrior into the gentle father these broken children desperately needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Some things in this world break your heart beyond repair, and watching children sold like cattle is one of them. In that cold northern market, two little boys held each other tight, knowing they might be torn apart forever. Their eyes held that look every parent fears most, the emptiness of children who have lost everything. Then a giant stepped forward. Erik Stormbringer was a mountain of a man. When he shouted, "Stop! I'll take those twins," everyone thought they knew what he wanted them for. They were wrong. What could possibly transform a legendary warrior into the gentle father these broken children desperately needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days passed in awkward silence before Erik discovered the wooden horse. He had given the boys the small room that connected to his own chambers, spreading thick furs on the floor to serve as beds. They accepted his offerings of bread and stew without complaint, ate what they needed, and spent their waking hours huddled together by the fireplace, speaking only to each other in whispers too soft for him to hear. Erik found himself walking on the balls of his feet around his own home, afraid that any sudden noise might send them fleeing like startled deer. He had faced charging cavalry without flinching, had stared down kings and warlords with nerves of steel, but the simple act of caring for two traumatized children left him feeling more helpless than he had ever been in battle. On the third evening, while preparing their usual simple meal of bread and vegetable broth, Erik heard an unfamiliar sound coming from their room. It was quiet crying, not the wailing of a tantrum, but the careful, muffled sobs of someone trying desperately not to be heard. He set down his wooden spoon and moved to their doorway, peering around the frame. The smaller boy, the one with wheat-colored hair, sat with his back against the wall, clutching something small against his chest. His shoulders shook with suppressed grief, while his brother wrapped protective arms around him and whispered words of comfort. Between the smaller boy's hands, Erik caught a glimpse of carved wood, a toy of some kind, though its details were obscured by the child's desperate grip. "May I see?" Erik asked softly, announcing his presence rather than startling them. Both boys looked up with wide eyes. They had not yet grown accustomed to his gentle tone, still expecting the harsh commands they had learned to fear. The smaller boy pressed the object closer to his chest, but his brother studied Erik's face for a long moment before giving a slight nod. With infinite care, the wheat-haired boy extended his hands. Resting in his small palms was a wooden horse, no longer than Erik's thumb. It had been carved with exceptional skill, every muscle and flowing mane rendered with loving detail. The wood was worn smooth by countless small fingers, and Erik could see where tears had darkened its surface. "It was our papa's," the copper-haired boy said, speaking for the first time since Erik had brought them home. His voice carried the refined accent of noble birth, but it cracked with barely contained emotion. "He made it for Finn when he was very small." Finn. So the smaller boy had a name, and now Erik had it. He filed the information away carefully, along with the knowledge that their father had been skilled with wood and had loved his children enough to craft toys with his own hands. "It's beautiful work," Erik said honestly. "Your father was a craftsman." He was Lord Aldrich of Thornfield, the copper-haired boy continued, his chin lifting with pride despite his circumstances. Our mamma was Lady Gwendolen. They ruled the Southern Vale with kindness and justice. The past tense struck Erik like a physical blow. These were not merely orphan children. They were the survivors of a noble house that had been destroyed. In his experience, such destructions rarely happened by accident. What happened to them? Erik asked, though he dreaded the answer. The boy, who had not yet offered his own name, stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. Raiders came in the night, Northmen with axes and torches. They killed everyone. The guards, the servants, our parents. Mama hid us in the root cellar before they broke down the doors. We heard her screaming. His voice remained steady, but his hands trembled slightly. When morning came, everything was burned. Everyone was dead. Erik felt a familiar cold rage building in his chest, the same fury that had once driven him to legendary acts of violence. But this was different. This was not the calculated anger of a warrior seeking victory in battle. This was the protective wrath of something deeper, something that demanded justice for innocence destroyed. "How long ago?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Last autumn. They kept us in cages through the winter, moving us from place to place. They said we were too young to be useful, but that someone might pay for noble blood eventually." The boy's composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow down his cheeks. They said no one would miss us, that no one even knew we had survived. Finn continued to clutch his wooden horse, his small body shaking with renewed grief. Erik found himself kneeling beside both boys, without conscious thought, his large hands hovering uncertainly, before gently settling on their shoulders. "You have names," he said firmly. "You have worth. You are the sons of people who loved you, enough to die protecting you." He felt them lean slightly into his touch, seeking comfort they had been denied for months. "And you are under my protection now. Anyone who wishes to harm you will have to come through me first." The copper-haired boy looked up at Erik with something approaching hope. "Do you mean that, truly?" "I have never broken my word to anyone," Erik replied. "I will not start with you." He paused, then added, "What is your name?" "I would know what." "To call the young lord who has honored my house with his presence." A ghost of a smile crossed the boy's features. "Marcus, son of Aldrich, this is my brother Finn." He straightened his shoulders, mimicking the formal posture he had been taught. "In his father's hall. We are pleased to make your acquaintance, Lord Erik." "Just Erik," the giant corrected gently. "I gave up my titles long ago. Here, we are simply family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Family. Erik had not used that word in reference to himself for more than 2 decades. He had convinced himself that he was meant for solitude, that his violent past disqualified him from such simple human connections. But looking at these 2 broken boys, seeing how they clung to each other and to the last remnant of their fathers, love, Erik felt something shift inside his chest. A wall that he had built brick by brick over years of guilt and isolation began to develop cracks. Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, making an obvious effort to compose himself. "The raiders who killed our family. They had the mark of the raven on their shields. Do you know such men?" Erik's blood turned to ice water. The raven was the symbol of Ragnar Blood-Eye, a man Erik had once fought beside in a dozen campaigns. They had been friends, or as close to friends as 2 professional killers could be. Ragnar led a warband of the most ruthless mercenaries in the northern kingdoms, taking contracts that other warriors deemed too dishonorable to accept. "I know them," Erik said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made both boys look at him with sudden concern. "Did they say why they came? Did they take anything besides lives?" Marcus shook his head. "They burned everything. Papa tried to fight them, but there were too many. He held them at the main door while Mama got us to safety." Fresh tears streamed down his cheeks. He died buying us time to hide. Lord Aldrich had been a good man then, a father who put his children's lives before his own, even when he knew the cost. The kind of man Erik had spent years killing for coin, though he had always told himself that his targets deserved their fates. "Your father was brave," Erik said, meaning every word. "His sacrifice saved your lives, and that means something. It means everything." He stood slowly, his mind already turning over possibilities and plans. If Ragnar had attacked Thornfield, it had been for a specific reason. Mercenaries of his caliber did not waste time and blood on random raids. Someone had paid him to destroy the House of Aldrich, which meant someone had wanted Marcus and Finn dead, along with their parents. The fact that the boys had survived was a miracle. The fact that they had ended up at a slave auction suggested that whoever had ordered the raid believed them safely dead. As long as the world continued to think the sons of Aldrich had perished with their parents, Marcus and Finn would remain relatively safe. But Erik would not forget. He would not forgive. And someday, when the boys were old enough to fend for themselves, he would seek answers to questions that had been written in their parents' blood. For now, though, his duty was simpler. He would be what these children needed him to be: protector, provider, and perhaps even father. The wooden horse in Finn's hands was a reminder of what they had lost, but it could also be a symbol of what they might still find. Love had many forms. Erik was about to learn them all. The wooden spoons were a disaster from the moment Erik picked up his carving knife. He had spent the morning watching Marcus attempt to eat stew with a bent metal implement that was far too large for his small hands, while Finn struggled to manage even the smallest portion without spilling half of it down his front. Such a simple problem should have had a simple solution, but Erik found himself staring at a piece of maple wood as if it held the secrets of the universe. How hard could it be to carve a spoon? He had once carved intricate runes into weapon hilts, had fashioned arrow shafts that flew straight and true. A child's eating utensil should be well within his capabilities. 3 hours later, Erik held up his first attempt and frowned. The implement in his hands looked more like a small club than anything designed for eating. The bowl was uneven and far too shallow, while the handle was thick enough to serve as a weapon. When he tested its balance, it felt clumsy and wrong. "Perhaps it needs more work," Marcus observed diplomatically from his seat by the fire. Finn giggled behind his hand, the first genuinely happy sound Erik had heard from either boy. "Perhaps," Erik agreed, setting aside the failed spoon and reaching for another piece of wood. "I may be somewhat out of practice with delicate work." The understatement drew another small laugh from Finn, and Erik felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fireplace. Such a simple sound, a child's laughter, but it carried more power than any battle cry he had ever heard. His second attempt proved marginally better, though the bowl was still lopsided and the handle bore gouges where his knife had slipped. The third spoon actually resembled something that might be used for eating if one were not particular about appearances. By the time the afternoon shadows were growing long, Erik had produced 2 wooden spoons that, while far from perfect, would at least serve their intended purpose. His hands ached from the unfamiliar precision work, and small cuts decorated his fingers where the blade had found flesh instead of wood. "They're wonderful," Marcus declared with such earnest enthusiasm that Erik suspected the boy was being kind rather than honest. Finn nodded eagerly, reaching for one of the crude utensils and testing its weight in his small hand. It was clearly oversized for him, but he smiled as if Erik had presented him with a treasure crafted from gold and silver. That evening's meal was the first they shared without the underlying tension that had marked their previous interactions. The boys chattered quietly between themselves while they ate, occasionally including Erik in their conversations with shy questions about his life in the mountains. Erik found himself struggling to answer even the simplest inquiries. How could he explain his solitary existence to children who had grown up surrounded by family and community? How could he describe the guilt that had driven him to this remote place without burdening them with knowledge they were too young to? "Carrie, do you get lonely up here by yourself?" Marcus asked as he carefully scraped the last of his stew from the bowl with his new wooden spoon. The question caught Erik off guard. Lonely. He had chosen solitude deliberately, had sought it out, as both punishment and protection. But looking at his small table, seeing how much warmer his home felt with their presence, he realized that loneliness had indeed been his constant companion for 15 years. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I thought I preferred it that way." "And now?" Vin asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Erik met the boy's eyes, bright blue like his mother's had probably been, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of himself. "Now I think I may have been wrong about many things." The next morning brought their first real test as a makeshift family. Erik woke to the sound of retching from the boys' room, followed by Finn's weak cries. He found the smaller boy burning with fever, his small body racked with chills, despite the warmth of the furs piled around him. Erik had tended battlefield wounds, had seen men die from infections and disease, but the sight of this fragile child, suffering from what appeared to be a simple stomach ailment, left him feeling utterly helpless. His hands, so steady when wielding a sword, trembled as he felt Finn's forehead. "He gets sick sometimes," Marcus explained, his own face pale with worry. "Mama used to make him special tea and sit with him until the fever broke." Tea! Erik's knowledge of medicinal herbs was limited to the battlefield varieties, plants that could dull pain or prevent wound infection. He had no idea what might help a sick child, and the nearest healer lived in the village below, a full hour's walk each way. "Stay with your brother," Erik instructed Marcus. "Keep him covered and try to get him to drink water if he can hold it down. I'll return as quickly as possible." The journey to the village had never seemed so long. Erik pushed his horse harder than he normally would, his mind filled with images of returning home to find Finn worse, or worse still, not finding him at all. The responsibility of caring for another's life had always weighed heavily on him. But this was different. This was not a fellow warrior who had chosen the risks of battle. This was an innocent child who depended entirely on Erik's ability to protect and provide. Astrid Moonwhisper was the village healer, a woman of perhaps 40 winters, whose knowledge of herbs and remedies was renowned throughout the region. She was also one of the few people in the settlement who had never shown fear in Erik's presence, meeting his rare visits to her shop with professional courtesy rather than nervous deference. "Child's fever," Erik said without preamble when she looked up from her grinding pestle. "Vomiting, chills. He's very young." Astrid's eyebrows rose slightly. The entire village knew by now that the legendary Erik Stormbringer had purchased 2 boys from the slave market, though the rumors about his intentions grew more lurid with each telling. That he would seek healing for them suggested motivations other than those whispered about in taverns and kitchens. "How young?" she asked, already moving toward shelves lined with various dried plants and prepared remedies. 8 winters, perhaps. 9, small for his age. She nodded, selecting several items and wrapping them in clean cloth. Willow bark tea for the fever, chamomile for the stomach upset. Honey if you have it. Children take medicine more easily when it's sweetened. She paused, studying Erik's face with sharp brown eyes. "You look like a man who's never nursed a sick child before." "I haven't," Erik admitted. "I don't know what I'm doing." Something in his honest confession seemed to soften her expression. Few parents do, especially at first. Children are surprisingly resilient, but they need patience and gentle care. The tea should help, but mostly he needs rest and someone to sit with him. Fear makes illness worse in the young. She handed him the wrapped remedies and waved away his offer of payment. Bring him to me if the fever doesn't break by tomorrow evening, and Erik—" She caught his arm as he turned to leave. "Whatever the gossips are saying about your reasons for taking those boys, I can see the truth in your eyes. They're lucky to have found you." 2 years had passed since that cold morning in the marketplace, and the transformation in Erik's household was nothing short of miraculous. Where once his mountain home had been a silent monument to solitude, it now rang with the sounds of childhood, laughter, arguments, the constant patter of small feet racing through rooms that had known only stillness for far too long. Marcus, now 10, had grown into his role as the elder brother with natural grace. His copper hair had darkened to a rich auburn, and his frame was beginning to show the promise of the strong man he would someday become. More importantly, the haunted look had faded from his eyes, replaced by the bright curiosity of a child who felt safe enough to explore the world around him. Finn, approaching 9 winters, remained smaller than his brother, but had developed a quiet confidence that spoke to the security he felt in their unconventional family. His artistic talents had blossomed under Erik's patient encouragement, and his small hands could now craft detailed carvings that rivaled the work of village craftsmen twice his age. The wooden bear that rested on the mantelpiece was Finn's latest creation, its features so lifelike that visitors often did a double take when first noticing it. The toy had taken him 3 weeks to complete, working carefully each evening by the firelight, while Erik struggled through increasingly complex reading lessons, and Marcus practiced the swordwork that his guardian had reluctantly agreed to teach. "It's remarkable," Astrid said, running her fingers over the smooth curves of the carved bear. She had become such a constant presence in their home that Erik had finally built her a room of her own, though they had yet to formalize their relationship. With marriage vows, Finn has his father's gift with wood, but his skill surpasses anything I've seen from such young hands. Erik nodded with the quiet pride that had become characteristic of his discussions about the boys. Every small accomplishment, Marcus reading an entire page without assistance, Finn completing a particularly challenging carving, both children helping with household chores without being asked, filled him with a satisfaction deeper than any. Military victory. The village had gradually accepted their unusual family arrangement. Children were resilient, and Marcus and Finn had won over even the most skeptical residents through their polite behavior and obvious happiness. When old Henrik, the blacksmith, had taken a bad fall and needed help with his work, it was Marcus who had volunteered to assist, demonstrating the kind of community spirit that Erik had tried to instill in both boys. The traveling merchant was asking about them again yesterday, Astrid mentioned casually, though Erik caught the undertone of concern in her voice. Same questions as before. Where they came from, whether they had family looking for them. Erik felt the familiar cold touch of vigilance that had kept him alive through countless battles. The merchant in question had appeared in their village 3 times over the past year, always claiming to be passing through on routine business. But his interest in Marcus and Finn seemed unusually persistent for someone with no apparent connection to them. "What did you tell him?" Erik asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the protective anger beginning to stir in his chest. "The same thing I always tell curious strangers, that they're local children who lost their parents to fever and that you've given them a good home." Astrid moved closer to Erik, lowering her voice so the boys wouldn't overhear from where they sat by the fire. "But I think he knows there's more to the story. He asked specifically about their ages, whether they might be from noble stock." The question struck too close to dangerous territory. Erik had always known that someday the past might catch up with them, but he had hoped for more time. Time for the boys to grow strong enough to protect themselves. Time for the world to forget. "About the lost sons of Lord Eldrick. Marcus," Erik called softly. "Finn, come here, please." Both boys looked up from their evening activities, Marcus had been practicing letter formation, while Finn put the finishing touches on a small wooden horse that was clearly inspired by his treasured memento from their father. They approached, with the easy confidence of children who had never been summoned for punishment or harsh words. "There's something we need to discuss," Erik began, choosing his words carefully. "You both remember the stories I've told you about being careful around strangers, about not sharing too much information about your past?" Marcus nodded seriously. At 10, he understood more about their precarious situation than his younger brother, though both children had been taught basic caution without being frightened unnecessarily. "There's a man who's been asking questions about you in the village," Erik continued. "He may mean no harm, but we need to be extra careful for a while. If anyone you don't know tries to talk to you, you come straight home and tell me immediately." "Is someone trying to take us away?" Finn asked, his small hand unconsciously reaching for the wooden horse in his pocket, a gesture that had become his way of seeking comfort when worried. Erik knelt to bring himself closer to the boy's eye level. "No one is going to take you away from me," he said firmly. "You are my sons now in every way that matters. But part of protecting family means staying alert to potential dangers." The word sons still felt momentous each time Erik spoke it aloud. It carried weight and responsibility that had reshaped his entire understanding of purpose and meaning. These children were not merely his charges or his wards. They were his legacy, his future, the best thing he had ever accomplished in a life that had been marked by far too much violence and destruction. Marcus straightened his shoulders in the way he did when accepting serious responsibility. "We'll be careful, Papa Erik. We won't talk to strangers and we'll stay close to home." Papa Erik. The title had evolved naturally over the months, becoming as natural to them all as breathing. Erik had never asked for it, never demanded the acknowledgement, but when it first slipped from Marcus's lips during a moment of excitement about a successful hunt, it had felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. "Good boys," Erik said, pulling them both into the kind of embrace that would have seemed impossible for the legendary warrior he had once been. "Now, let's finish our evening lessons. Finn, show me what you've learned about shaping the horse's mane." They settled back into their routine, but Erik remained watchful. The merchant's questions had awakened the strategic mind that had kept him alive through decades of conflict. Someone was looking for Marcus and Finn, and that someone had resources, enough to send agents across multiple villages. As he watched Finn carefully work the wood, with tools Erik had crafted specifically for his small hands, the giant reflected on how much they all had to lose now. 2 years ago, he had been a man with nothing left to care about. Now, he had everything worth protecting. The wooden bear on the mantelpiece seemed to watch over them all, its carved eyes alert and protective. Like Erik himself, it had been transformed, from something wild and dangerous into a guardian of the innocent. The difference was that Erik's transformation was real, rooted in love and purpose that had given his life meaning beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever threats emerged from the shadows of the past, he would meet them with the same fierce devotion that had turned a legendary killer into the gentlest of fathers. Marcus and Finn were his sons, and that bond was stronger than blood, more enduring than any oath sworn on battlefield or throne room. No one would take them from him, not while breath remained in his body and strength remained in his sword arm. The carved bear seemed to nod its approval, and Erik smiled despite his concerns. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges it chose to deliver. Tonight, his family was safe, warm, and whole beneath his protection. That was enough. That was everything. The healing pendant caught the firelight as it swayed gently against Astrid's throat, its polished stone reflecting the warm glow that filled Erik's home on this most important of evenings. She had worn it every day since, her grandmother's passing 10 years prior, But tonight it seemed to hold special significance, a bridge between the family she had lost and the one she was about to gain. "Are you certain about this?" Erik asked for perhaps the dozenth time, his massive hands uncharacteristically nervous as he adjusted the simple gold band that had belonged to his own mother decades ago. "Marriage to a man like me will bring challenges you may not have considered." Astrid smiled with the patient affection of a woman who had observed Erik's gentle transformation over the past 2 years. "I'm marrying the man who carves wooden spoons for orphaned boys and stays awake all night when they have fevers," she replied softly. "The man who struggles through children's books because he wants to read them bedtime stories. That's not a challenge, Erik. That's a gift." From the kitchen came the sounds of Marcus and Finn, attempting to prepare a celebratory feast with the help of several village women who had insisted on contributing to the wedding preparations. The boys had thrown themselves into the planning, with enthusiasm that warmed Erik's heart, determined to make their father's wedding day perfect in every detail. "Papa Erik looks scared," Finn observed in a stage whisper that carried clearly through the thin walls. "Do you think he's going to run away?" "Don't be silly," Marcus replied with the worldly wisdom of his 10 years. "He's just nervous. Mama Astrid told me that's normal for men on their wedding day." Mama Astrid. The title had emerged naturally, as their relationship had deepened, and hearing it never failed to bring tears to Astrid's eyes. She had always wanted children, but had resigned herself to spinsterhood after her previous suitor had died in a hunting accident years before. Finding love with Erik had been unexpected enough. Discovering that it came with 2 sons who needed her maternal care had seemed like a miracle beyond all reasonable hope. "They're right, you know," Astrid said, reaching up to touch Erik's cheek with gentle fingers. "You do look terrified. What frightens you so much about making our family official?" Erik struggled to find words for the complex emotions churning in his chest. "I've never deserved happiness," he said finally. "My life has been built on violence and death. Sometimes I wake up expecting to find that all of this, the boys, you, this peace, has been nothing but a dream sent to torment me." "And what do you find when you wake up?" Astrid asked gently. Marcus practicing his letters by the window, Finn humming while he works on his carvings, you brewing tea and planning improvements to our home. Erik's voice grew stronger as he spoke, the reality of his transformed life overriding his ancient or guilt. "I find a family that somehow sees something worth loving in a man who spent decades as a professional killer. We see the man who chose love over violence," Astrid corrected. "The man who could have taken those boys for any number of dark purposes, but instead chose to give them the childhood they deserved. That choice defines you far more than any past actions." The ceremony itself was simple, but meaningful, conducted by the village elder in the main room of Erik's home, with their closest friends as witnesses. Marcus and Finn stood as Erik's attendants, their faces glowing with pride and excitement as they watched their beloved guardian formally commit to the woman who had become their mother in all but blood. When Erik placed the ring on Astrid's finger, his hands were steady despite the magnitude of the moment. He was no longer the solitary warrior who had lived as a hermit in the mountains. He was a husband, a father, the head of a household that had become the center of his entire universe. "You may kiss your bride," the elder announced with a smile that suggested he had never expected to see the day when the legendary Erik Stormbringer would participate in such a gentle ceremony. The kiss was tender rather than passionate, mindful of their young audience, but full of promise for the private moments they would share as husband and wife. When they separated, both Marcus and Finn cheered with unrestrained delight, and the small gathering erupted in applause and well wishes. The celebration continued late into the evening, filled with traditional foods, local musicians, and the kind of community fellowship that Erik had observed from a distance for years, but never experienced as a participant. He found himself laughing at stories shared by neighbors who no longer saw him as a dangerous outsider, but as one of their own, a man who had earned their respect through his devotion to his family. As the evening wound down and their guests began to depart, Erik stepped outside to enjoy a moment of quiet reflection under the star-filled mountain sky. The night air was crisp with the promise of approaching autumn, and the sounds of celebration from within his home created a warm counterpoint to the wilderness silence he had once treasured. "Happy, Papa?" Marcus asked, appearing beside him with the silent grace he had inherited from his noble bloodline. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Erik replied honestly. "Are you happy, both of you? This changes nothing about our relationship, but it does mean Astrid will officially be your mother now." "She's been our mother for months," Marcus said, with the practical wisdom that frequently surprised Erik. "The ceremony just makes it official for everyone else." He paused, studying Erik's profile in the starlight. "Will you and Mama Astrid have children of your own someday?" The question was asked with the careful casualness of a boy who needed reassurance about his place in the family structure. Erik understood the underlying concern immediately. Would new children diminish his love for his adopted sons? "Perhaps," Erik said gently. "Would that trouble you?" Marcus considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. "I think I'd like to be a big brother to your children with Mama Astrid," he said finally. "Finn and I know what it's like to need protecting. We could help teach them to be safe and happy." The generosity of the response struck Erik like a physical blow. These boys, who had lost everything and been sold like livestock, were already thinking about how they could nurture and protect future siblings. Their capacity for love and kindness, despite everything they had endured, never ceased to amaze. "Any children Astrid and I might have would be incredibly fortunate to have you and Finn as older brothers," Erik said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've both grown into remarkable young men. Your birth parents would be so proud of who you've become." They stood together in comfortable silence, father and son watching the stars and listening to the sounds of their family settling in for the night. In the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the moon, but the sound held no threat for Erik. His pack was complete now, his territory established and defended. As they turned to go back inside, Erik caught sight of a figure watching them from the tree line, too distant to identify, but close enough to be clearly human. The watcher vanished the moment Erik focused on the spot, melting into the forest shadows with practiced stealth. Erik's warrior instincts flared to full alertness, but he kept his expression calm for Marcus's sake. Someone was indeed watching his family, someone with skills that suggested professional training. The questions from the traveling merchant had not been idle curiosity after all. "Time to go in," Erik said casually, though every nerve in his body had suddenly become hyper-alert. "Tomorrow we begin our new life as a complete family." As they entered the warm glow of home, Erik's mind was already turning over defensive strategies and escape routes. His family's happiness would not be destroyed by whatever threats were gathering in the darkness. He had found peace, love, and purpose beyond anything he had ever imagined possible, and he would kill anyone who tried to take it from him. The healing pendant caught the firelight as it swayed gently against Astrid's throat, its polished stone reflecting the warm glow that filled Erik's home on this most important of evenings. She had worn it every day since her grandmother's passing, 10 years prior, but tonight it seemed to hold special significance, a bridge between the family she had lost and the one she was about to gain. "Are you certain about this?" Erik asked for perhaps the 10th time, his massive hands uncharacteristically nervous as he adjusted the simple gold band that had belonged to his own mother decades ago. "Marriage to a man like me will bring challenges you may not have considered, Astrid smiled with the patient affection of a woman who had observed Erik's gentle transformation over the past 2 years. "I'm marrying the man who carves wooden spoons for orphaned boys and stays awake all night when they have fevers," she replied softly. "The man who struggles through children's books because he wants to read them bedtime stories. That's not a challenge, Erik. That's a gift." From the kitchen came the sounds of Marcus and Finn attempting to prepare a celebratory feast with the help of several village women who had insisted on contributing to the wedding preparations. The boys had thrown themselves into the planning with enthusiasm that warmed Erik's heart, determined to make their father's wedding day perfect in every detail. Papa Erik looked scared. Finn observed in a stage whisper that carried clearly through the thin walls. "Do you think he's going to run away?" "Don't be silly," Marcus replied with the worldly wisdom of his 10 years. "He's just nervous. Mama Astrid told me that's normal for men on their wedding day." Mama Astrid. The title had emerged naturally as their relationship had deepened, and hearing it never failed to bring tears to Astrid's eyes. She had always wanted children, but had resigned herself to spinsterhood after her previous suitor had died in a hunting accident years before. Finding love with Erik had been unexpected enough. Discovering that it came with 2 sons who needed her maternal care had seemed like a miracle beyond all reasonable hope. "They're right, you know," Astrid said, reaching up to touch Erik's cheek with gentle fingers. "You do look terrified. What frightens you so much about making our family official?" Erik struggled to find words for the complex emotions churning in his chest. "I've never deserved happiness," he said finally. "My life has been built on violence and death. Sometimes I wake up expecting to find that all of this, the boys, you, this peace, has been nothing but a dream sent to torment me." "And what do you find when you wake up?" Astrid asked gently. Marcus, practicing his letters by the window. Finn humming while he works on his carvings. You brewing tea and planning improvements to our home. Erik's voice grew stronger as he spoke, the reality of his transformed life overriding his ancient guilt. "I find a family that somehow sees something worth loving in a man who spent decades as a professional killer." "We see the man who chose love over violence," Astrid corrected. "The man who could have taken those boys for any number of dark purposes, but instead chose to give them the childhood they deserved. That choice defines you far more than any past actions." The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, conducted by the village elder in the main room of Erik's home, with their closest friends as witnesses. Marcus and Finn stood as Erik's attendants, their faces glowing with pride and excitement as they watched their beloved guardian formally commit to the woman who had become their mother in all but blood. When Erik placed the ring on Astrid's finger, his hands were steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. He was no longer the solitary warrior who had lived as a hermit in the mountains. He was a husband, a father, the head of a household that had become the center of his entire universe. "You may kiss your bride," the elder announced with a smile that suggested he had never expected to see the day when the legendary Erik Stormbringer would participate in such a gentle ceremony. The kiss was tender rather than passionate, mindful of their young audience, but full of promise for the private moments they would share as husband and wife. When they separated, both Marcus and Finn cheered with unrestrained delight, and the small gathering erupted in applause and well wishes. The celebration continued late into the evening, filled with traditional foods, local musicians, and the kind of community fellowship that Erik had observed from a distance for years, but never experienced as a participant. He found himself laughing at stories shared by neighbors who no longer saw him as a dangerous outsider, but as one of their own, a man who had earned their respect through his devotion to his family. As the evening wound down and their guests began to depart, Erik stepped outside to enjoy a moment of quiet reflection under the star-filled mountain sky. The night air was crisp with the promise of approaching autumn, and the sounds of celebration from within his home created a warm counterpoint to the wilderness silence he had once treasured. "Happy, Papa?" Marcus asked, appearing beside him with the silent grace he had inherited from his noble bloodline. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Erik replied honestly. "Are you happy, both of you? This changes nothing about our relationship, but it does mean Astrid will officially be your mother now." "She's been our mother for months," Marcus said, with the practical wisdom that frequently surprised Erik. "The ceremony just makes it official for everyone else." He paused, studying Erik's profile in the starlight. "Will you and Mama Astrid have children of your own someday?" The question was asked with the careful casualness of a boy who needed reassurance about his place in the family structure. Erik understood the underlying concern immediately. Would new children diminish his love for his adopted sons? "Perhaps," Erik said gently. "Would that trouble you?" Marcus considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. "I think I'd like to be a big brother to your children with Mama Astrid," he said finally. "Finn and I know what it's like to need protecting. We could help teach them to be safe and happy." The generosity of the response struck Erik like a physical blow. These boys, who had lost everything and been sold like livestock, were already thinking about how they could nurture and protect future siblings. Their capacity for love and kindness, despite everything they had endured, never ceased to amaze him. "Any children Astrid and I might have would be incredibly fortunate to have you and Finn as older brothers," Erik said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've both grown into remarkable young men. Your birth parents would be so proud of who you've become." They stood together in comfortable silence, father and son watching the stars and listening to the sounds of their family settling in for the night. In the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the moon, but the sound held no threat for Erik. His pack was complete now, his territory established and defended. As they turned to go back inside, Erik caught sight of a figure watching them, and from the tree line, too distant to identify, but close enough to be clearly human. The watcher vanished the moment Erik focused on the spot, melting into the forest shadows with practiced stealth. Erik's warrior instincts flared to full alertness, but he kept his expression calm for Marcus's sake. Someone was indeed watching his family, someone with skills that suggested professional training. The questions from the traveling merchant had not been idle curiosity after all. "Time to go in," Erik said casually, though every nerve in his body had suddenly become hyper-alert. "Tomorrow we begin our new life as a complete family." As they entered the warm glow of home, Erik's mind was already turning over defensive strategies and escape routes. His family's happiness would not be destroyed by whatever threats were gathering in the darkness. He had found peace, love, and purpose beyond anything he had ever imagined possible, and he would kill anyone who tried to take it from him. The forged death certificate lay spread across Erik's wooden table like an accusation written in legal script and official seals. The parchment was yellowed with age and bore the proper markings of the southern courts, but Astrid's keen eye for detail had spotted the inconsistencies that revealed its fraudulent nature. "The date is wrong," she explained, pointing to the carefully inscribed symbols that had fooled lesser observers. "This claims Lord Hadric of Ravenshollow died 3 months before the attack on Thornfield, but I've seen his authentic signature on trade agreements from only 2 months ago. He was very much alive when his brother's family was murdered." Erik felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, not the hot fury of battle, but the calculating anger of a predator who had finally identified his prey. the man who had arrived that morning claiming legal guardianship over Marcus, and Finn was not their grieving uncle seeking to honor family obligations. He was the architect of their parents' destruction, the puppet master who had orchestrated the raid that orphaned them and left them to be sold like cattle. "So Uncle Heydrich faked his own death," Marcus said quietly, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were discovering. "But why?" Astrid consulted the other documents they had spread across the table, papers that told a story of debts, failed investments, and mounting desperation. "Your uncle was drowning in gambling debts to some very dangerous people. If your father and you boys died, he would inherit the Thornfield estates and treasury, enough wealth to pay his creditors and still live comfortably. But we didn't die," Finn whispered, unconsciously clutching his wooden horse. "We hid in the cellar like Mama told us to." "And your uncle believed you had perished with your parents," Erik added grimly. "The raiders he hired were supposed to leave no survivors. When they reported the house burned and the family dead, he assumed his plan had succeeded perfectly." The sound of horses approaching interrupted their discussion. Through the window, Erik could see a substantial party of armed men surrounding the modest dwelling, far more than would be necessary for a simple legal matter. Heydrich himself sat his mount with the arrogant posture of a man who believed he held all the advantages, his expensive clothing and well-fed appearance a stark contrast to the lean desperation that had driven him to murder his own brother's family. "Remember what I taught you," Erik murmured to the boys as he moved to answer the inevitable knock at his door. "Stay calm, stay together, and trust that I will protect you no matter what happens." Heydrich was a soft man, made cruel by desperation and greed. His resemblance to the boys was unmistakable. The same copper-colored hair, though his had thinned with age and worry, the same fine bone structure that spoke of noble breeding. But where Marcus and Finn radiated the confidence of children who felt secure in their father's love, their uncle carried the hunted look of a man who had sacrificed honor for survival and found the bargain wanting. "Erik Stormbringer," Heydrich announced in a voice that attempted authority but carried undertones of fear. "I am Lord Heydrich of Raven's Hollow, rightful guardian of these boys you have unlawfully harbored. I've come to reclaim my nephews and return them to their proper station in life." "Your nephews believe you to be dead," Erik replied evenly, making no move to invite the man inside. "Curious how you managed to recover from that unfortunate condition." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Heydrich's features, but he pressed forward with his rehearsed presentation. "Rumors of my death were greatly exaggerated. I was grievously wounded in the same attack that claimed my brother's life, and spent months recovering in a monastery far from civilization. I've only recently learned that the boys survived and have been searching for them ever since." It was a plausible story, Erik had to admit. Certainly more believable than the truth that this man had hired the very raiders who killed his brother, then spent 2 years believing himself free of inconvenient family obligations until learning that his victims' children had not only survived but were thriving under another man's protection. "An interesting tale," Erik said. "Perhaps you could explain why your death certificate bears official seals dated months before the attack on Thornfield, or why your debts to the gaming houses of the capital remain unpaid despite your supposed recovery of the family fortune." Heydrich's composure cracked slightly, revealing the desperate animal beneath the nobleman's facade. "I don't know what lies you've been told, but I am the boy's bloodkin. By law and right, they belong with me. They belong where they choose to be," Marcus declared, stepping forward with the courage that had sustained him through 2 years of healing and growth. "And we choose to stay with our real father." The words struck Heydrich like physical blows. These were not the broken, traumatized children he had expected to find, Marcus stood tall and proud, every inch the young lord his birth father had been. Finn, though smaller and more reserved, displayed the quiet confidence of a child who had never doubted his place in the world. They had been healed, loved, and nurtured into the strong young men they were meant to become. More than that, they had found a father who would die before allowing them to be harmed again. "You know nothing of your true heritage," Hadric snarled, his mask of civilized concern finally slipping completely. "You're the sons of Lord Aldrich of Thornfield, heirs to lands and titles that this mountain hermit could never provide. I offer you wealth, education, your rightful place among the nobility. You offer us the protection of the man who had our parents murdered," Finn said quietly, his young voice carrying a weight of understanding that made Eric's heart clench with protective fury. Hadric's face went pale. "You can't possibly know." "We know everything," Marcus interrupted. "We know you hired the raiders. We know you faked your death to avoid your gambling debts. We know you planned for all of us to die so you could steal our inheritance." The admission hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. Hadric's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, suddenly uncertain about their employer's true motives for this expedition. Mercenaries they might be, but most drew the line at participating in the murder of children for profit. "You have no proof," Hadric said desperately. "Even if you did, who would believe the word of orphaned children over that of a lord?" "I would," called a familiar voice from the forest path. Village Elder Thompson emerged from the trees, followed by a substantial group of Eric's neighbors. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly, and the community had rallied to defend the family that had become one of their own. "And I suspect the King's magistrate would be very interested in these documents we've uncovered." Eric felt a surge of gratitude for these people who had accepted him and his unusual family, despite their initial fears and suspicions. They stood ready to fight for Marcus and Finn, to protect children who had won their hearts through simple goodness and joy. But Hadric was a desperate man with nothing left to lose, and desperate men were capable of terrible choices. His hand moved toward the sword at his belt, and Eric saw the calculation in his eyes. If he could not reclaim the boys legally, perhaps he could silence them permanently and claim they had died in some tragic accident. The threat crystallized Eric's resolve into diamond-hard certainty. This man had already murdered his brother and sister-in-law. He had sold 2 innocent children into slavery and spent 2 years believing himself free of consequence for his crimes. Eric would not allow him to harm his sons. "You have a choice," Eric said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of violence that had once made his name legendary across 3 kingdoms. "You can leave now, abandon whatever claim you think you have to these boys, and disappear back into whatever hole you've been hiding in for the past 2 years." "And if I refuse?" Hadric demanded, though his voice shook with the knowledge of what he was challenging. Eric smiled, and for the first time in years, it was the expression of the man who had once been called the Phantom of the Northlands. "Then you'll discover why they used to tell stories about me around campfires, and why smart men crossed themselves when they heard my name." The wooden horse in Finn's pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, as if his father's spirit was reaching across the veil between worlds to protect his sons one final time. The family that had been broken by greed and violence would not be destroyed again, not while Erik Stormbringer drew breath to defend them. The ancient battle axe felt strange in Eric's hands after years of wielding nothing more dangerous than carving knives and woodsman's tools. Its weight was familiar yet foreign, like greeting an old friend who had changed in fundamental ways during a long separation. The weapon bore the scars of countless battles, nicks in the blade where it had met enemy steel, worn grooves in the handle where his fingers had gripped it through campaigns across 3 kingdoms. He had pulled it from its hiding place in the cellar after Hadric's ultimatum, knowing that diplomacy had run its course and that the confrontation to come would require him to become, once again, the warrior he had spent years trying to forget. But this time would be different. This time he would not fight for gold or glory or the thrill of victory. This time he fought to protect the most precious things in his world. "You don't have to do this alone," Astrid said quietly, watching him test the axe's balance with movements that spoke of deadly expertise. "The entire village stands with us. Elder Thompson has sent word to the regional magistrate." "Legal remedies take time," Erik replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had made peace with what must be done. "Hadric won't wait for magistrates and court proceedings. He's desperate, which makes him dangerous. Men like that don't surrender. They escalate until someone stops them permanently." From the main room came the soft sounds of Marcus and Finn, working on their evening tasks, maintaining the routines that had given their lives structure and comfort for the past 2 years. Marcus was practicing his sword forms with the wooden practice blade Erik had crafted for him, while Finn continued work on his latest carving. A detailed miniature of their makeshift family gathered around the dinner table. The normalcy of their activities provided stark contrast to the violence being prepared in the cellar below. Erik had spent days planning for this confrontation, considering every advantage and vulnerability, every possible outcome and response. He knew Hadric's type, weak men who hired others to do their killing, who relied on legal technicalities, and superior numbers rather than personal courage. But desperate weak men were often the most dangerous of all, because they had no honor to restrain their choices when cornered. "The boys have written their letters," Astrid continued, referring to the formal statements Marcus and Finn had prepared at Erik's suggestion. In their own words, they had detailed their uncle's crimes, their choice to remain with their adoptive father, and their testimony about the love and security they had found in Erik's home. The documents were hidden in multiple locations throughout the village, copies sent to trusted friends in distant settlements, insurance against the possibility that Hadric might attempt to silence all witnesses to his crimes. If Erik fell in the coming battle, if the boys were taken or worse, their story would survive to demand justice. "They're remarkable children," Erik said, pride and love evident in his voice despite the grimness of their situation. "Stronger than they know, braver than anyone should have to be at their age. Whatever happens tomorrow, they'll survive and thrive. I've made certain of that." Astrid moved closer, her healer's hands gentle as they touched the scars that mapped Erik's violent history across his shoulders and arms. "You've given them more than survival," she said softly. "You've given them the knowledge that they're worth fighting for, worth dying for. That kind of love shapes a person's entire life." The observation struck deeper than Erik had expected. His own childhood had been marked by abandonment and neglect, by foster families who saw him as an extra mouth to feed rather than a person deserving of affection. He had spent his adult years believing that violence was his only talent, that death and destruction were the only legacy he could leave behind. Marcus and Finn had changed all of that. Through their simple need for protection and care, they had revealed capacities within him that he had never known existed. He had discovered that his hands, so skilled at dealing death, could also braid hair and carve toys and tend fevered brows with infinite gentleness. More importantly, he had learned that love was not a weakness to be guarded against, but a strength that could transform even the most hardened heart into something worthy of respect and admiration. "Promise me something," Erik said, turning to face his wife fully. "Whatever happens in the coming days, don't let them blame themselves. Children always think they're responsible when adults fight over them. Make sure they understand that this is about Hadric's greed and my choice to protect them. Nothing more, nothing less." "You're not going to die," Astrid said fiercely, her healer's determination evident in every word. "I won't allow it. Those boys need their father, and I need my husband. You'll find a way to end this that doesn't require your death." Erik wished he could share her certainty, but he had seen too many battles to harbor illusions about guaranteed outcomes. Skill and experience provided advantages, but they could not eliminate the element of chance that made every fight potentially lethal. All he could do was prepare thoroughly, fight intelligently, and trust that his motivations would provide the edge he needed to prevail. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Marcus appeared at the top of the cellar. Stairs, his young face serious with concern and determination. "Papa Erik," he said formally, using the tone he adopted when discussing matters of grave importance. "Finn and I have been talking, and we want you to know that we understand what's happening. We're not afraid." Erik climbed the stairs to meet his son at eye level, struck once again by the boy's courage and maturity. "You should be afraid," he said honestly. "Fear keeps us alive when danger threatens. But you should also know that I will never allow anyone to harm you or take you from this family." "We know," Marcus replied simply. "You've never broken a promise to us. We trust you completely." The faith in those words was both humbling and terrifying. Erik had survived decades of warfare by never allowing anyone to depend on him completely, by maintaining the emotional distance necessary for tactical thinking. But these children had stripped away all his defenses, had made him vulnerable in ways that should have been crippling, but instead felt like the source of his greatest strength. "There's something else," Marcus continued, glancing back toward the main room where Finn waited. "We want to help. We're not warriors like you, but we're not helpless either. You've taught us to think, to plan, to work together. Let us be part of protecting our family." The request struck at the heart of Erik's deepest conflict. Every instinct demanded that he shield the boys from the violence to come, that he preserve their innocence by handling the threat himself. But he could see in Marcus's eyes the same need for agency that had driven Erik himself to take up arms as a young man, the refusal to be passive when those he loved were threatened. "What did you have in mind?" Erik asked, already dreading the answer, but respecting the boy's right to be heard. Marcus straightened his shoulders in the gesture that had become familiar whenever he was about to propose something particularly mature and thoughtful. "Uncle Hadric expects us to be frightened children who will run to him when you're defeated. He doesn't know that we understand his crimes, or that we have evidence of his guilt. We could use his assumptions against him." The plan that Marcus outlined was simple but clever, relying on misdirection and the element of surprise rather than physical confrontation. It would require the boys to place themselves in potential danger, but no more so than they already faced by being Hadric's targets. Erik listened with growing admiration for the strategic mind his son was developing. Marcus had inherited more than his father's noble bearing. He possessed the tactical thinking that could someday make him a leader worth following. "It's a good plan," Erik admitted finally, "but it requires precise timing and absolute trust. Between all of us, if any element goes wrong, then we adapt and overcome," Finn said softly, appearing beside his brother with the quiet confidence that had replaced his earlier timidity. "That's what families do, isn't it? We protect each other." Erik looked at his sons, no longer the broken, terrified children he had claimed from that terrible auction, but strong young men who understood both the value of the life they had built together and the price that might be required to preserve it. They had been forged in the crucible of loss and trauma, but they had been tempered by love and security until they became something remarkable. Tomorrow would test them all in ways that Erik hoped they would never face again. But tonight, surrounded by the warmth of their home and the bonds that made them family, he allowed himself to believe that love might indeed prove stronger than greed, that justice might triumph over corruption, that the simple goodness of children might shine bright enough to illuminate even the darkest corners of human nature. The battle-axe caught the firelight as Erik carried it back to its hiding place, its blade reflecting not the promise of death, but the fierce determination to preserve life. He had been many things in his years: warrior, legend, hermit, killer, but the title he wore with the greatest pride was the simplest one of all. He was a father, and that was worth fighting for with everything he possessed. The village square had never witnessed a confrontation like this one. What should have been a routine morning market day had transformed into something that would be remembered and retold for generations. The day the legendary Erik Stormbringer faced down a corrupt nobleman who had tried to steal his children. Word had spread through the settlement like wildfire, and it seemed every resident had found reason to conduct business in the square that morning. They formed a rough circle around the central area, maintaining careful distance, but unwilling to miss what promised to be either a triumph of justice or a tragedy of epic proportions. Heydrich arrived with a dozen armed men, their weapons gleaming, in the morning sunlight as they took positions around the square's perimeter. The nobleman himself had donned his finest clothing: rich velvet doublet, polished leather boots, a sword that had probably never drawn blood in anything more dangerous than a formal duel. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed superior numbers guaranteed victory. Erik stood alone in the center of the square, his battle-axe resting casually against his shoulder. He wore simple leather and wool, the practical garments of a mountain dweller rather than the elaborate armor of his warrior days. But his presence dominated the space in ways that fine clothing and superior numbers could not match. This was a man who had faced armies and emerged victorious, who had earned his legendary reputation through skill rather than inherited privilege. "I've come for my nephews," Heydrich announced, his voice carrying across the silent square. "Return them to me, and there need be no violence here today." "Your nephews have made their choice," Erik replied calmly. "They wish to remain with their family. I suggest you respect that decision and depart in peace." Marcus and Finn stood with Astrid near the village fountain, their positions carefully chosen to be visible to the crowd but protected by the solid stone structure. Both boys held themselves with dignity, despite the danger swirling around them, their faces reflecting the courage their adoptive father had nurtured over 2 years of love and guidance. "They are children," Heydrich snarled. "They cannot make such decisions for themselves. By law, blood kinship supersedes any emotional attachments they may have formed." Elder Thompson stepped forward, his weathered hands holding the documents that had exposed Heydrich's deception. "Perhaps you could explain these financial records, Lord Heydrich. They paint an interesting picture of a man desperate enough to murder his own brother for inheritance gold." Heydrich's composure cracked visibly. "Those documents are forgeries, produced by this criminal to justify his theft of my family's children. And yet they bear the authentic seals of the gaming houses where you accumulated your debts," Astrid called out, her healer's training making her an expert at reading the subtle signs of deception in human behavior. Amazing how detailed these forgeries are. The crowd murmured among themselves, the tide of opinion shifting as the evidence of Heydrich's crimes became clear to all present. These were simple people, but they understood greed and corruption when it stood revealed before them. More importantly, they had watched Erik's transformation from feared hermit to beloved father over the past 2 years. They knew which man deserved their trust and support. "Enough of this charade," Heydrich declared, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "I am a lord of the realm, and these children are my property by right of blood. Stand aside, mountain man, or face the consequences of your defiance." Erik shifted his weight slightly, a movement so subtle that only trained warriors would recognize it as the first step in a combat stance that had claimed hundreds of lives. His voice remained calm, but something fundamental had changed in his demeanor. The gentle father had stepped aside to reveal the legendary killer beneath. "I am Erik Stormbringer," he said quietly, his words carrying across the square with perfect clarity. "I have stood against armies and walked away victorious. I have faced kings and champions and monsters, and I have never yielded ground when protecting what matters to me." His grey eyes fixed on Heydrich with laser intensity. "These boys are my sons. Touch them and you die." The promise was delivered without heat or drama, simply stated as an inevitable fact of nature. The sun would rise in the east, water would flow downhill, and anyone who threatened Marcus or Finn would meet their end at the edge of Erik's axe. Heydrich's hired mercenaries began to look distinctly uncomfortable. Fighting for gold was one thing, but facing the Phantom of the Northlands in defense of his children was quite another. Several of them had heard the stories, the tales of impossible victories against overwhelming odds. They had assumed those stories were exaggerations, legends grown larger with each telling. Looking at Erik now, seeing the deadly certainty in his stance and the cold promise in his eyes, they were no longer sure the legends had been exaggerated at all. "Kill him," Heydrich ordered desperately, his voice cracking with fear and rage. "Kill them all if necessary, but bring me those boys." The words hung in the morning air like a death sentence, and Erik smiled, not with warmth or humor, but with the terrible anticipation of a predator who had finally been given permission to hunt. The battle was about to begin. The village charter was older than memory, its parchment yellowed and brittle with age, but its words still carrying the weight of law throughout the northern kingdoms. Elder Thompson held it aloft like a shield as Heydrich's mercenaries hesitated on the edge of violence, their professional instincts warring with their employers' increasingly desperate commands. By the ancient rights granted to this settlement, Thompson declared in a voice that had guided the village through decades of challenges and celebrations, "We claim protection over all who have made their homes among us, through honest means and good character. Any who would do violence to our adopted family does so in defiance of laws older than any noble's claim to blood kinship." Erik had not known of the charter's existence, but he recognized the tactical advantage it provided. The mercenaries were professionals who understood that breaking ancient laws came with consequences that extended far beyond any single contract. Kings took a dim view of those who violated settlement charters, especially when witnesses could testify to the crimes. But Heydrich was beyond rational calculation now. His carefully constructed facade of legitimate concern had crumbled completely, revealing the desperate criminal beneath. He drew his ornate sword with shaking hands, the blade reflecting morning sunlight as he pointed it toward Erik with theatrical menace. "I don't care about your primitive laws or your barbarian customs," he snarled. "Those boys represent my salvation, and I will not be denied by a collection of peasants and a washed-up killer living in exile." The insult to their community galvanized the villagers in ways that abstract legal documents could not. These were proud people who had carved their lives from unforgiving mountain territory through cooperation and mutual support. They had accepted Erik and his sons as family, and they would defend that family with the same fierce loyalty they showed to their own children. Marcus stepped forward from his protective position near the fountain, his young voice carrying clearly across the tense square. "Uncle Heydrich," he said with the dignity of his noble birth, "you killed our parents. You sold us into slavery. You have forfeited any claim to kinship or authority over our lives. You have no proof," Heydrich began, but Finn interrupted him with quiet certainty. "We have your own words," the younger boy said, his small hand emerging from his pocket with a carved wooden bird that seemed innocent enough until one noticed the tiny holes drilled into its body. "Did you think we were too young to understand the value of evidence? Papa Erik taught us to be prepared for anything." The revelation that their conversation had been recorded sent visible shock through Heydric's ranks. Several mercenaries began backing away from their positions, their professional survival instincts overriding their employer's coin. They had signed on to intimidate villagers and retrieve children, not to participate in crimes that could be proven in court. "Clever boys," Erik said with genuine pride, though he never took his eyes off the remaining threats. "Your birthfather would be proud of how thoroughly you've honored his memory." Heydric's face flushed red with rage and desperation. With his hired sword abandoning him and his crimes exposed before witnesses, he had only one option remaining: the desperate gamble of a man with nothing left to lose. "If I cannot have them," he screamed, raising his ornate blade above his head, "then no one can." He lunged toward the boys with wild abandon, his technique clumsy, but his intent deadly clear. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended as the corrupt nobleman's sword descended toward the children who had already suffered so much at his hands. Then Erik moved. The legendary warrior's reflexes had not dulled during his years of peaceful domesticity. If anything, his motivation had sharpened them to a razor's edge. He covered the distance between himself and his sons with inhuman speed, his battle axe describing a perfect arc that intercepted Heydric's blade with a ringing crash that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The impact jarred the sword from Heydric's grip, sending the ornate weapon spinning across the cobblestones. The nobleman stumbled backward, his face pale with shock and dawning terror, as he realized he now faced Erik Stormbringer, alone and weaponless. "You chose this," Erik said quietly, his axe resting easily in his hands despite its lethal potential. "You could have walked away. You could have accepted that your crimes had consequences. Instead, you chose to threaten my children." But instead of delivering the killing blow that everyone expected, Erik stepped back and lowered his weapon. The crowd held its collective breath, uncertain what mercy or judgment the legendary warrior would choose. "Marcus, Finn," Erik called. Without taking his eyes off their defeated uncle, "What does justice look like to you? He is your parents' brother, your bloodkin despite his crimes. The choice should be yours." The boys looked at each other, sharing one of their silent communications. Before Marcus spoke for them both, "Let him live," he said with wisdom beyond his years. "Our parents believed in mercy for those who truly repented. If Uncle Heydric can find genuine remorse for what he's done, perhaps he can still become the man they once loved." Erik nodded, pride swelling in his chest at their capacity for forgiveness. These children had transformed him from a killer into a father. Now they were teaching him that the greatest strength lay not in the ability to take life, but in the wisdom to preserve it when possible. Justice would be served through law rather than sword, and mercy would triumph over vengeance. The family that had been forged in love had proven itself unbreakable. The family portrait carved into the oak mantelpiece was Finn's masterpiece, a work of art that captured not just the physical likenesses of Erik, Astrid, Marcus, and himself, but somehow managed to convey the love that bound them together across the boundaries of blood and birth. 5 years had passed since that confrontation in the village square, and the carving had become the centerpiece of a home that had expanded to accommodate new additions to their unconventional family. Erik stood in the doorway of his workshop, watching 17-year-old Marcus demonstrate proper sword technique to his younger siblings, the twin daughters that Astrid had given birth to 3 years prior. The girls, named Gwendolen and Aldara in honor of their older brothers' lost parents, possessed their mother's quick wit and their father's protective instincts in equal measure. "Keep your guard up, Gwen," Marcus instructed with the patient authority of a natural teacher. "Remember, your opponent will look for any opening you give them." Gwendolen, now 4 years old with her mother's brown hair and Erik's grey eyes, nodded seriously as she adjusted her grip on the wooden practice sword that Erik had crafted specifically for her small hands. Her sister Aldara preferred to watch from a safe distance, her artistic temperament more closely aligned with Finn's gentle nature than with the warrior traditions that had shaped their family's history. Finn, now 14 and grown tall and lean, sat nearby putting the finishing touches on a wooden puzzle box he was creating as a wedding gift for one of their village neighbors. His skill with woodworking had developed to the point where nobles from distant kingdoms commissioned pieces. From the young craftsman, whose reputation was beginning to rival his adoptive father's legendary prowess with weapons. "Papa Erik," Gwendolyn called, noticing his presence in the doorway. "Watch me show Marcus the move you taught me." Erik smiled, stepping into the afternoon sunlight to observe his youngest daughter's determined attempt at a defensive sequence that was far too advanced for her age, but which she approached with the fearless confidence of a child who had never known anything but love and support. The technique was sloppy and would have been useless in actual combat, but Erik applauded her effort with genuine enthusiasm. "Excellent form, little warrior. Keep practicing, and someday you'll be teaching your brothers instead of learning from them." "Will I be as good a fighter as you were?" Gwendolyn asked with the directness that characterized all children her age. Erik knelt to bring himself to, her eye level considering his answer carefully. "You have the potential to be whatever you choose to become," he said finally. "Fighter, healer, craftsman, leader. The choice will be yours to make when you're old enough to understand what each path requires." It was a conversation he had with all his children at various stages of their development, helping them understand that strength came in many forms and that their worth was not dependent on following in his footsteps. Marcus had shown natural aptitude for leadership and would likely seek service with a noble house or perhaps establish his own holding when he came of age. Finn had found his calling in artistic creation, bringing beauty into the world rather than taking life from it. Each child was encouraged to develop their own gifts, their own dreams, their own understanding of how they might contribute to the world around them. "The magistrate's messenger arrived this morning," Astrid said, emerging from the house with refreshments for the children. "Uncle Hadric's trial has concluded. He's been sentenced to 20 years of service at a monastery, where he'll work to repay his victims and contemplate the consequences of his choices." Erik nodded approvingly. Justice had taken its course through legal channels rather than vigilante action, exactly as Marcus and Finn had requested that day in the village square. Hadric would live, but his freedom to harm others had been permanently curtailed, and his remaining years would be dedicated to making whatever amends were possible for his crimes. "Do you think he'll ever truly repent?" Marcus asked, having overheard their conversation. At 17, he had grown into a thoughtful young man whose questions often revealed depths of wisdom that impressed his adoptive father. "That's between him and his conscience," Erik replied. "We can only control our own choices, our own responses to the challenges life presents. You and Finn chose mercy when you could have demanded vengeance. That choice says more about your character than anything Hadric does or doesn't feel about his crimes." As evening approached and the family gathered around their dinner table, Erik found himself reflecting on the miraculous transformation that had occurred in his life. The silent, haunted warrior who had once lived alone in these mountains had been replaced by a man whose days were filled with laughter, learning, and the constant, wonderful chaos of raising children. The wooden horse that had once been Finn's only connection to his murdered father now rested in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, surrounded by the artifacts of their new life together. It served as a reminder of loss and resilience, of the love that had sustained the boys through their darkest hours, and the love that had healed them in the years since. "Tell us the story again," little Aldara requested as they finished their meal, "about how Papa Erik saved Marcus and Finn from the bad men." Erik looked around the table at his family, his wife, his sons, his daughters, all of them bound together by choice rather than chance, by love rather than mere blood relation. The story had become part of their family mythology, told and retold, with variations that emphasize different lessons depending on the ages and needs of the listeners. Tonight, as he began the familiar tale, Erik emphasized the themes that had shaped their life together: courage in the face of injustice, the power of love to transform even the hardest heart, and the truth that family was defined not by birth, but by the choice to stand together through whatever challenges life might bring. Things in this world break your heart beyond repair, but sometimes broken hearts can be mended with love, patience, and the simple decision to choose hope over despair. Erik had learned that lesson from two frightened boys who had needed a father, and in becoming their father, he had discovered the man he was always meant to be. The giant Viking who had once shouted, "Stop! I'll take those twins," had indeed taken them, not as servants or trophies, but as beloved sons who had given him the greatest treasure any man could possess, a family worth living for, fighting for, and loving with every breath in his body.